Welcome to Yakutsk. In the depths of winter, the average low temperature hovers around a punishing -42 degrees Celsius. It gets so cold here that the warm air from buildings, cars, and even human breath cannot rise. Instead, it instantly freezes, creating a dense cloud of ice fog that swallows the streets for months on end. At these temperatures, the human body is under immediate threat. If you step outside unprepared, your exposed fingers can receive frostbite damage in as little as 3 to 7 minutes. Even a brief walk requires heavy insulation to keep your nose and cheeks from sustaining permanent tissue damage. Existing here requires radical adaptations. Engine oil thickens like glue, and tires can split open, so residents often leave their cars idling for hours overnight just to keep them functional. At the grocery store, markets simply leave fish and meat out on display in the open air for weeks, where the ambient temperature preserves them better than any commercial freezer. You might expect conditions this lethal to restrict human settlement to a small scientific outpost, but Yakutsk is a regional capital complete with universities, shopping malls, and high-rise apartments, home to nearly 400,000 people. It is the coldest major city on the planet. This map shows the Sakha region of Russia. It is roughly twice the size of Alaska. Placed over the United States, it would encompass the entire eastern half of the country. Yet across this immense territory live fewer than 1 million residents. Nearly 40% of that sparse population is packed into Yakutsk itself. It stands as the largest city in the world ever built within the permafrost zone, a region where the deep soil beneath the city remains frozen solid year-round, and has for thousands of years. That frozen ground comes with a severe penalty. It makes large-scale agriculture extremely difficult. The soil cannot easily yield the food supply needed to support a large population, meaning this isolated city cannot naturally feed itself from the land it sits on. Placing a metropolis in an environment that cannot grow food defies basic human geography. The existence of Yakutsk is a calculated outcome. It is the result of a 400-year chain of economic incentives that drew humanity into a frozen wilderness. The first lure bringing outsiders to this specific coordinate was the Lena River. Stretching for thousands of kilometers from Lake Baikal to the Arctic Ocean, it served as a seasonal highway deep into the Siberian interior during the brief window when the water was liquid and navigable. In 1632, Russian explorers pushing the frontier of their empire used this river network to enter the heartland of the indigenous Sakha people. The Russians established a small fort on the riverbank to extract furs as tribute, shipping the pelts back to Europe to be used as a form of currency. For centuries, the settlement barely grew. By the end of the 19th century, Yakutsk recorded a population of only 6,500 people. Because the permafrost prevented the local food production needed for a booming economy, the town remained a small, isolated resource colony. Fur extraction sustained the outpost for generations, but the settlement's transition into a metropolis began when geologists looked past the wildlife and into the frozen ground itself. In 1923, Soviet geologists exploring the southern Sakha region found gold. This discovery triggered a rush for fortune that would permanently change the demographics of the territory. Extracting that gold presented a severe logistical hurdle. Voluntary labor was insufficient for mining in -60-degree conditions. To solve the shortage, the Soviet government under Joseph Stalin utilized the Gulag system to import an involuntary workforce. Throughout Stalin's reign, tens of thousands of prisoners were brought to camps and penal colonies across the territory. They were used as labor to extract gold from the frozen earth. This influx of people from the European core of the Soviet Union rapidly expanded the region's population. This era established that industrial operations could function in the Siberian wilderness. By the end of the 1950s, the population of Yakutsk had expanded 7 times over, locking a massive population into an objectively hostile environment. The next economic trigger arrived shortly after World War II. In 1954, geologists located rich Kimberley pipes, revealing that the Sakha region contained roughly 25% of the world's entire diamond supply. To reach those diamonds, Soviet engineers carved one of the largest man-made holes on the planet, an open-pit mine 525 meters deep and a kilometer wide. The scale of the operation left a permanent scar on the Siberian landscape. The financial return was massive. By the late 1980s, diamond and gold mining were bringing $4 billion into the Soviet treasury every year. To maintain this wealth, the state imported a permanent, highly paid workforce to staff the regional offices and headquarters based in Yakutsk. High salaries and generous bonuses drew a fresh wave of residents. High-rise apartments, museums, and airports replaced the old frontier town. By the final years of the Soviet era, Yakutsk has fully transitioned into a modern, wealthy megacity. The state had created the economic incentive to live in the Arctic, but housing hundreds of thousands of modern citizens created an engineering crisis. They now had to figure out how to maintain a massive, heavy metropolis directly on top of ice. Building foundations directly on permafrost causes heat to seep downward. This melts the frozen soil into mud, causing the foundation to crack and sag. To prevent collapse, engineers elevate infrastructure on deep stilts, allowing freezing winter air to circulate underneath, keeping the permafrost solid. Because digging trenches would also melt the ice, essential utilities cannot be buried. All water and heating pipes must be run entirely above ground, snaking through streets in heavy insulation to avoid melting the soil or freezing solid. Outside the city, Yakutsk is isolated by the Lena River. There is no bridge connecting the city to the national highway system. Residents rely on expensive ferries during the summer or wait until winter when they can drive trucks directly across the frozen river highway. Yakutsk still functions as a logistical island. It requires constant engineering and massive amounts of capital just to keep its population supplied and functional in the middle of a frozen floodplain. Today, that infrastructure is facing an existential threat. The Arctic is currently warming at roughly twice the global average rate, beginning to thaw the layer of permafrost that the city relies on for stability. The decay is already visible. Sidewalks warp and buckle as the ground shifts. Despite decades of architectural effort, the thawing mud is causing buildings to sag and crack as the earth gives way beneath their foundations. Compounding this crisis is the lack of a reliable exit. Plans to build a $1.7 billion bridge across the Lena River have been repeatedly delayed by geopolitical shocks and military spending. The city remains logistically stranded as its physical foundations weaken. Yakutsk was built through a series of economic gambles that pushed the limits of the environment. After 4 centuries of forcing a city onto a frozen floodplain, the environment may finally be reclaiming the ground it stands on.